God help me, she's beautiful. Caleb Morgan said it under his breath, the moment the stagecoach door swung open. He had spent 3 months telling himself he wanted plain and practical. A working woman, someone sensible. He had written it in the letter, stated it plainly, meant every word. But the woman stepping down into the Wyoming light stopped every thought in his head cold. Not decorated beauty, something deeper and more dangerous than that. The kind that doesn't ask for your attention and gets it anyway. She looked up, found his eyes across the crowd in 3 seconds flat and didn't look away. Neither did he. If this is your first time here, subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. The morning the stagecoach was due, Caleb Morgan was already regretting every decision he had made in the past 3 months. He stood outside the general store with his hat pulled low and his jaw set the way it always was when he was fighting something inside himself. Something he wouldn't name out loud, not to Thomas Reed, not to anyone. The street was packed. Red Hollow had maybe 400 people on a good day, but it seemed like every single one of them had found a reason to be standing near the main road that morning. Mrs. Patterson from the millinery shop, old Joe Carver, who ran the feed store and hadn't left his porch in 2 winters. Even Reverend Hayes stood off to one side, with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the horizon like he was expecting a second coming instead of a stagecoach from Kansas. Caleb hated all of it. He hated the attention. He hated that people were watching him the way they watched a horse auction, curious, assessing, waiting to see if the man got his money's worth. He hated that he'd let Thomas talk him into this at all. But mostly, standing there in the Wyoming morning with the wind cutting through his coat, Caleb Morgan hated that he was nervous. A man his age, 38 years old, owner of the largest cattle operation in the valley. A man who had driven herds through mountain passes in February and sat across negotiating tables from men twice his age without flinching, and he was nervous about a woman stepping off a stagecoach. "You're pacing," Thomas said from beside him. "I'm standing still." "Your boot is moving." Caleb pressed his heel flat into the dirt and said nothing. Thomas Reed had been his closest friend since they were 17 years old, working cattle drives for other men and dreaming about land of their own. Thomas had built something good over the years, a family, a farm, a wife, who laughed loud enough to fill a whole house. He was the only person Caleb had ever let close enough to say the hard things. And 3 months ago, the hard thing Thomas had said was this: "You've been a ghost for 4 years, Caleb." Margaret wouldn't want that. It was the one argument Caleb didn't have a counter to. Because he knew it was true. Margaret had been the most alive person he'd ever known, and she had married him specifically because she said he made her feel like the world was bigger than it was. She would have hated what he'd become since losing her. The silence, the routine, the way he'd turned the ranch into a machine instead of a life. So he'd written the letter. He'd written it 3 times, actually crumpling up the first 2 because they sounded like a land deed instead of a request for companionship. The final version was plain and honest. He said he was a widower. He said he had a working ranch and no patience for pretense. He said he was not looking for beauty or charm, or a woman who needed managing. He said he wanted someone who understood labor, who could hold a conversation, who wouldn't be swallowed up by the isolation of valley life. He said there would be no dishonesty between them. He said that was the only thing he had left to offer that was worth anything his word. The agency had written back with 3 names. He'd chosen Clara Whitmore based on 2 sentences she'd written herself and included with her profile sentences the agency had passed along, almost apologetically, as if they weren't sure they should have included them at all. She had written, "I am not coming west looking for rescue. I am coming west looking for ground worth standing on." Those 2 sentences had done something to him. He still couldn't fully explain. He'd told himself it was practical. He'd told himself those words simply suggested she was the kind of woman who wouldn't fall apart. But Thomas had read them over his shoulder and raised both eyebrows and said, "Caleb, You read that 6 times. And Caleb had told him to mind his business and folded the letter away. Now the stagecoach was coming. He could hear the wheels before he could see it, that familiar rumble and clatter rolling through the cold air, the driver's voice calling out to the horses as it came around the last bend and entered the main street of Red Hollow. The crowd shifted forward. Caleb didn't move. The coach pulled to a stop. The driver climbed down. The door swung open. A woman stepped out. She was not what the town was expecting. He could tell that immediately from the sound that moved through the crowd. Not the sound of approval exactly, more the sound of recalibration, like everyone had been holding one picture in their minds, and were now quietly replacing it with something different. She wasn't young in the way the gossip had assumed. She wasn't decorated. She wore a plain dark dress, well kept but clearly traveled. Her hair was pinned back practically. She carried one medium-sized bag and set it down on the ground herself without waiting for the driver to help her. She looked at the crowd, the way someone looks at a situation they've assessed before they've walked into it, with a kind of watchful calm that didn't come from comfort. It came from experience, and then she looked at Caleb. He didn't know how she picked him out so quickly. He wasn't standing forward. He wasn't the tallest man there, but her eyes found him in about 3 seconds flat, and when they did, he said it before he could stop himself, before he even fully understood he was speaking out loud. "That can't be my bride," he said it quietly. He meant it privately. But the crowd had been so hushed in that moment that the words carried, and Clara Whitmore heard them as clearly as if he'd said them directly to her face. She didn't flinch. She didn't redden or look down. She reached down and lifted her bag in one hand, walked across the space between them with steady steps, and stopped 2 feet away from him. She was shorter than him by nearly a head, but the way she held herself erased that difference in the mind immediately. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. Her voice was even and clear. "And I believe you are Caleb Morgan." The crowd breathed again. Caleb looked at her. For one long, unguarded moment, he just looked, and then the familiar discipline came back, the armor he'd been wearing for 4 years, and he straightened and said, "That's right. Welcome to Red Hollow." His voice came out more formal than he intended. More distant. Something moved across Clara's face, not hurt, not quite. More like recognition, like she'd seen this kind of wall before and knew exactly what it was made of. "Thank you," she said simply. Thomas appeared at Caleb's shoulder with the energy of a man who had been saving up politeness for an occasion. "Thomas Reed," he said, extending his hand to Clara with a wide smile. "Old friend of this gentleman's. It's a genuine pleasure, Miss Whitmore. You'll have to forgive the audience. This town has a regrettable relationship with other people's business." Clara shook his hand, and the corner of her mouth lifted just barely. "I grew up in a town with 400 people," she said. "I'm familiar with the condition." Thomas laughed. Several people nearby laughed too. Caleb did not. The wagon ride to the ranch was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Clara sat on the bench across from him, her bag held between her feet, looking at the land. Caleb watched the road and told himself he was not sneaking glances at her. He was not. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. "About 6 miles. "And how many head of cattle are you running?" He looked at her then. "Beg your pardon?" "Cattle," she said again. "Approximately how many?" "Currently about 800, he said slowly. "Why?" "I like to know the scope of things I'm walking into." She shifted her gaze from the road to him briefly, then back. "I assume you have ranch hands. How many?" 7 regular. 2 more during branding season. She nodded, as if she were filing this information somewhere useful. "What did your wife pass from?" she asked. And the question landed so directly that for a moment he couldn't process it. He stiffened. "That's a personal question." "No," she said. "I'm sorry if it's too soon. You don't have to answer." But then after a pause he did. He didn't know why. "Fever, 1,879. 4 years ago this November." Clara was quiet for a moment. "My father passed in 81. Heart." She said it plainly, without performing grief, which somehow made it more real. It changes everything, losing someone like that. The whole shape of a day. Caleb gripped the reins a little tighter. Yes, he said. That was all. The house was not what Clara said anything about, but he watched her face when she walked through the front door, and he read it in her expression, not disappointment, not pleasure, but that same quick assessment she'd turned on the crowd. She took in the space, the practical furniture, the layer of function without comfort. A place that had stopped being a home and become a shelter. "I'll show you to your room," he said. Before that, Clara said, setting her bag down, "Where is the kitchen?" "First door on the right. But you don't need to." "I've been on a stagecoach for 3 days," she said. "I need to do something with my hands. I'll make supper." He didn't argue with her, partly because he didn't know how, and partly because he caught himself thinking, for one irrational second, that the idea of a made supper was something he hadn't thought about in so long that he'd stopped noticing the absence. He went outside and worked until the light faded. When he came back in, there was bread on the table, a pot of something hot. The lamp was lit in the kitchen, and it threw light into the hallway in a way that stopped him in the doorway, for a moment he would never admit to anyone. He sat down. Clara sat across from him. They ate in silence for a while. "What made you decide to do this?" he said finally. "Come west through an agency." She looked at him with those direct eyes. "What made you?" I asked first. "Fair enough," she thought for a moment. "I have no family left. I used everything I had to help my father through his last 2 years. After he passed, there wasn't much remaining, not money, not prospects in a town where everyone had already decided who I was." She said it without bitterness, just fact. "I figured if I was going to rebuild, I might as well rebuild somewhere that needed building." Caleb turned that over. "And why not just find work somewhere?" "A city, because I wanted a life," she said. "Not just an occupation." She met his eyes. "Is that foolish?" He was quiet for a beat. "No," he said. "I don't think it is," she nodded. "Your turn." He set his fork down. He wasn't expecting to be held to it. My friend wouldn't leave me alone about it. She waited, and I suppose he stopped. Tried again. "The house has been very quiet." She didn't say anything to that. She didn't offer sympathy or smile knowingly. She just nodded once, as if she understood the exact weight of that sentence, and let it stand. That night, Caleb sat in the chair by the window long after the lamp in Clara's room went dark. He was trying to organize his thoughts and failing. The woman was nothing he'd expected. She wasn't meek. She wasn't difficult. She asked direct questions and gave direct answers, and looked at everything like she was already trying to figure out how to be useful to it. He thought about Margaret. He always did, in moments like this. And he noticed, with a guilt he wasn't sure was warranted, that the thought didn't feel the same as it usually did. It felt smaller, not less important, never less important. But smaller, the way a thing that was very big gets smaller when something equally large moves into the same space. He told himself to go to sleep. He didn't sleep for a long time. The next morning, Clara was awake before him. He came down to find her in the kitchen, not just organizing, though she'd clearly done that too, but repairing the hinge on one of the cabinet doors with a carriage driver she had found somewhere. She heard him come in and looked up without stopping what she was doing. "This was about to fall off," she said. "I know. Did you not have a screwdriver?" "I have 10. Then it should have taken you 3 minutes." He looked at her. She went back to the hinge. He didn't have an answer for that because she was right. He poured himself coffee and sat down. "Where did you learn to do things like that?" "From my father, and from necessity." She tightened the last screw and tested the door. He believed that capable was its own form of safety. That if you could fix a thing yourself, nobody could hold the broken thing over you. Caleb thought about that. Smart man. He was. She set the screwdriver on the table and poured her own coffee and sat across from him. "Tell me about the ranch, the actual work. What does a day look like?" So he told her. He hadn't talked about the ranch, really talked about it in years. His workers knew their jobs. Thomas knew the broad strokes. But nobody asked him about the specifics anymore. about how he rotated the grazing sections or managed the water rights with the neighboring properties, about the decisions he'd been wrestling with regarding the northern pasture. He talked for 20 minutes before he realized it, and Clara sat across from him with her coffee and listened with the kind of attention that made him feel like what he was saying actually mattered to someone other than himself. "The northern pasture problem," she said when he slowed. "Is the water source issue a seasonal thing or chronic?" "Seasonal, but it's getting worse. 2 dry summers in a row." "Have you looked at digging a secondary channel from the creek on the east side?" "I'm not sure of the exact terrain, but depending on the grade." He stared at her. "How do you know about irrigation management?" Clara smiled, a real one this time, brief and warm. "I told you my father handled documents for families in need. A lot of those families were farmers. I learned what I could because the people sitting across the table from us needed answers, not just paperwork." She tilted her head slightly. "Did I overstep?" "No," Caleb said, and he meant it. "No, actually," he set his coffee down. "Walk with me today. I'll show you the east section." She blinked, like she hadn't expected that. And that one expression, the slight widening of her eyes before she caught herself, told him something important about Clara Whitmore. This was a woman who expected to be underestimated. She'd built her confidence, not from being praised, but from being ignored and proving herself anyway. "All right," she said. "Give me 10 minutes." The town started talking within 48 hours. That was less than Caleb had expected. "Honestly, Mrs. Patterson started it. Of course, she always started everything. With a performance of concern at the general store. That was really just a public inquiry into Clara's credentials. Was she really educated? Was she really from Kansas? Didn't she seem older than expected? Didn't Caleb say he wanted a practical woman, but wasn't there something a little too practical about her? A little too confident? Thomas's wife Eliza told Caleb about it when she came by with a welcome pie for Clara and stayed for 3 hours. "She's something," Eliza said to Caleb in the yard while Clara was inside, showing Eliza's youngest daughter how to braid rope. "I don't mean that as an insult. I mean she's genuinely something." "What are they saying in town?" Caleb asked. Eliza gave him the look she'd been giving him for 20 years, the one that meant he already knew, but she'd explain anyway. "They're wondering if she's what she says she is. She's too comfortable. Too capable. They expected someone who needed things." She paused. "They expected someone you'd be able to feel sorry for." Caleb's jaw tightened. "That's not what I wanted." "I know that. I'm just telling you what they expected." "What do you think?" he asked, and he was surprised that he actually wanted the answer. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that woman has been carrying a very heavy load for a very long time, and she's so used to it that she doesn't even notice the weight anymore. And I think that's either the best thing or the saddest thing I've ever seen, and I can't decide which." Caleb looked toward the house. Through the window he could see Clara's silhouette, her hands moving, her head turned toward the child. He didn't answer Eliza, but something in his chest did something that he resolutely ignored. The first real test came at the end of the first week. His lead ranch hand, a man named Deke Harmon, who'd been with him for 6 years, and ran the morning operations with the authority of a man who'd earned every ounce of it, came to Caleb with a problem. One of the younger hands, a kid named Bo, had made a mistake in the feed scheduling that would cost them. Not a catastrophic mistake, but an expensive one. Deke wanted Bo fired. Caleb was about to agree when Clara appeared in the doorway of the barn. He hadn't known she was there. He hadn't known she was in the barn at all. But there she was, and Deke saw her. And his expression shifted, not hostile exactly, but proprietary in the way men sometimes got when they felt their space was being entered by someone they hadn't decided to trust yet. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," Deke said, with exactly the kind of politeness that isn't politeness. "Good morning, Mr. Harmon." She stepped fully into the barn. "I heard you discussing Bo." Deke looked at Caleb. "I was talking to Mr. Morgan." "I know," Clara said evenly. But I'd like to ask one question before a decision is made, if that's all right." She looked at Caleb. He nodded, not entirely sure why. "How old is Bo?" she asked Deke. Deke blinked. 17. And what was he told when he started about the feed rotation schedule? A pause. He was given the chart. But was he told what the chart meant? Was the consequence of an error explained to him? Deke crossed his arms. He should have asked if he didn't understand. "He's 17 years old," Clara said quietly. "He probably didn't know what he didn't know." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm not saying there shouldn't be a consequence. I'm saying that the consequence that costs you nothing is the one that teaches him something. Fire him and you've lost a hand and he's learned nothing. Make him understand what he cost you. Put him on reduced work for 2 weeks, have him shadow whoever manages the feed properly, and in a year you might have your most careful hand." Deke stared at her, then he looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Clara. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to win anything. She genuinely meant every word of it. "That's not a bad idea," Caleb said. Deke worked his jaw for a moment. "It's your ranch," he said finally. He looked at Clara one more time, and something in that look had shifted, Caleb noticed. Not acceptance, not yet, but something that was the beginning of it. When Deke walked out, Caleb turned to Clara. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know, he won't appreciate it right away. Know that too." She moved toward the barn door. "But the boy will." She left without waiting for his response, and Caleb stood alone in the barn with the strange, uncomfortable, somehow entirely welcome sensation of being surprised. That evening he sat across from her at dinner and watched her hands while she passed the bread, and he thought about Eliza's words. "She's carrying a heavy load and doesn't notice the weight anymore." He thought he understood what Eliza had seen. There was a kind of practiced endurance in Clara that he recognized because he had built the same thing in himself, the ability to keep functioning when the heart had gone out of it. The ability to make a meal and fix a hinge and walk across a crowd's silent judgment without letting any of it break through. But there was something different in her too. Something that his own endurance had lost along the way. She still cared about Bo, about the ranch hands' families, about the right thing to do. She was carrying the weight, and she still cared about what happened to other people under it. He had stopped doing that, somewhere along the line. He hadn't noticed when. "Tell me something," he said, and she looked up. "Why did you really choose this particular advertisement? There must have been other options." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Because of what you wrote." He waited. "You wrote that you didn't want pretense," she said. "That you only had one honest thing left to offer." She looked at him with those clear, steady eyes. "I've spent a lot of years around people who wanted me to pretend. Pretend my father wasn't dying. Pretend there was more money than there was. Pretend I wasn't exhausted and scared, and doing everything alone." She paused. "A man who says he only has honesty left is a man who's been through something real. I'd rather sit across from someone who's been through something real than someone who hasn't." The lamp between them crackled softly. Caleb felt something come loose, just slightly, just enough in the wall he'd been maintaining. The mortar between two of the stones gave just a fraction, and he didn't try to push it back. "Clara," he said. "Yes, I'm going to tell you something I haven't said to anyone." He paused. "I don't entirely know how to do this. Any of it. I know how to run a ranch. I know how to manage men and land and money. But he stopped. Being present with someone. I stopped knowing how to do that when I lost Margaret. And I'm not sure I'll be good at relearning it." Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "That's the most honest thing you've said to me since I arrived." He nodded. "I'll take honesty over smooth," she said. "Every time." Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and the cattle settled, and the night sounds of the rain that Caleb had listened to alone for 4 years filled the air. But they sounded different tonight. They sounded like a background instead of an absence. He didn't know what to do with that. But, for the first time in a long time, he thought that maybe not knowing what to do was different from having nothing left to figure out. And somehow, in the strange, uncertain space between those two things, something had quietly begun. Something had shifted in the Morgan house, and everyone could feel it, except the two people living inside it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't announced. It happened the way weather changes in Wyoming gradually, and then all at once, so that by the time you noticed it, you couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had begun. Caleb kept telling himself that nothing was different, that Clara was simply a practical arrangement, that the warmth he felt walking back to the house in the evenings was just the contrast of cold air and a lit lamp, nothing more. But then she would say something, one sentence, plain as a nail, and it would stay with him for hours. She'd been at the ranch for 10 days. When Deke Harmon came to Caleb with something that surprised him more than the feed schedule incident. Deke wasn't a man who changed his mind quickly. He'd spent 30 years in cattle country and had the particular stubbornness of men who'd survived by trusting their own judgment over everyone else's. But he came to Caleb on a Tuesday morning before the rest of the hands were up, and he said it preamble the way Deke said everything. That woman gave Bo a reading lesson last night. Caleb looked up from the ledger. What? He can't read well, never told anybody. She figured it out when she saw him staring at the feed chart and not moving. Didn't make a thing of it. Just sat with him after supper and worked through it. Deke paused. Boy looked like he'd been handed something he didn't know how to hold. Caleb was quiet. I'm not saying I was wrong about firing him, Deke added quickly. I'm saying maybe you didn't make the wrong call keeping him. Another pause, longer. And maybe she's not what I thought she was. From Deke Harmon, that was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. But Caleb didn't get a chance to think too long about that. Because the same afternoon, he discovered something that tightened his chest in a way that had nothing to do with appreciation. He'd come in for water and found Clara at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger open in front of her. She wasn't doing anything wrong, he'd left it out, and she hadn't been hiding it. But she looked up when he came in, and instead of closing it, she met his eyes steadily. I wasn't prying, she said. I was looking for the supply order schedule, and this was the first book I picked up. I should have asked. He sat down across from her slowly. What did you see? She didn't pretend she hadn't looked. That you overpaid for the last 2 feed shipments by about 12%. And that your water rights agreement with the Dalton property expires next spring. The water rights. He hadn't told anyone about that. That's a conversation I've been managing on my own, he said, and he heard the edge in his voice and didn't fully apologize for it. I know, Clara said, and I'm not trying to take it from you. She closed the ledger carefully. But if the Dalton agreement lapses and Caldwell moves on it first. How do you know about Caldwell? He said it sharper than he meant to. Clara looked at him with an expression that was neither defensive nor apologetic. Just level, just entirely level, because I listen. Because your hands talk when they don't think anyone's paying attention. And because 3 separate people in town have mentioned Victor Caldwell's name in the same sentence as your ranch since I arrived. She folded her hands on the table. I'm sorry if I've overstepped. I'll stay out of it. He stood. He walked to the window. He stood there long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Victor Caldwell, he finally said, has been trying to buy this land for 2 years. Or failing that, make it impossible to run. He controls 3 of the ranches to the north. What he wants is the water. He didn't turn around. And now that the Dalton agreement is coming up, he's going to push. Then you need a lawyer, Clara said. I have one. In Cheyenne, he's good. Is he faster than Caldwell's money? Caleb turned. She was looking at him with the same directness that still caught him off guard. Sometimes the complete absence of softening. She wasn't trying to scare him. She was asking a real question. I don't know, he said honestly. Clara nodded. Then we should assume he's not. And prepare accordingly. The word "we" landed in the room between them, and neither of them addressed it directly, but it sat there, solid and new, like a piece of furniture that had been moved in overnight. The following Sunday, Thomas and Eliza came for dinner. and the evening turned into something Caleb hadn't experienced in so long he'd forgotten what to call it. Laughter. Real, unperformed laughter around a table, the kind that comes from people who are genuinely at ease rather than working at it. Eliza and Clara had taken to each other with a speed that Caleb found faintly bewildering. They were different in almost every visible way. Eliza's warm and expansive, and filling every room she entered. Clara contained and precise and choosing her words with care. But they understood each other's humor immediately, which was the more important thing. Thomas caught Caleb watching Clara at one point during the meal and gave him a look that Caleb answered with a stare that meant stop it, and Thomas answered with a smile that meant I'm not stopping anything, and Caleb looked back at his plate. Thomas tells me you've been here since you were young, Clara said to Caleb at one point. Since I was 22, came with $40 and a working knowledge of cattle. And now you have 800 head and the most contested water source in the valley. Thomas nearly choked on his coffee. She gets right to it, doesn't she? I like efficiency, Clara said mildly. She's not wrong, Caleb said and surprised himself. But the evening ended with something none of them planned. As Thomas and Eliza were leaving, Victor Caldwell's ranch foreman, a man named Garrett, rode past on the main road and pulled up just outside the gate. He looked at the house. He looked long enough that it wasn't casual. Thomas noticed it. Eliza noticed it. Clara, standing in the doorway, noticed it most of all. Garrett rode on without a word. That was deliberate, Clara said quietly from just behind Caleb's shoulder. Yes, Caleb said. He wanted you to know he was watching. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. Then, how soon do you think Caldwell makes his move? Before spring, Caleb said. Before the Dalton agreement renews. She nodded. He could feel her thinking beside him, even in the silence. And it occurred to him, standing there in the cold night air, with the sound of Thomas's wagon fading down the road, that this was the first time in 4 years he'd faced something difficult, and had a person standing next to him. Not behind him, not in front of him, next to him. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have made the difference it did, but it did. The second week became the third, and the rhythm of the ranch began to accommodate Clara, the way a river accommodates a new stone working around her. At first, then working with her, until it was difficult to remember how the current had run before. She took over the household accounts without being asked and without announcing it, simply because she was better at it, and she knew it, and she did things that needed doing without waiting for permission. Caleb watched her install herself into the operation of his life with a kind of quiet effectiveness that both awed and unsettled him. Unsettled him because he was aware, in a way he kept trying to suppress, that he looked forward to her being there. Not in the frantic way of new attraction, not the racing pulse and reckless feeling of young want. In a steadier, more dangerous way. The way you look forward to solid ground after standing in water. The way you look forward to something you didn't know you'd lost until it was already in front of you. He was sitting with that feeling on a Thursday evening when Clara came to find him in the barn, and the expression on her face stopped him. What is it? He said. Someone rode the fence line on the north boundary last night, she said. Martinez found the marks this morning, 3 separate places. Caleb straightened, checking for weaknesses. That's what Martinez thinks. When did you talk to Martinez? This morning when you were in town. She held his gaze. He came to me because he didn't want to worry you without more information. I told him to document everything and not to repair those sections yet. She paused. I hope that was right. Why not repair them? Because if Caldwell's men come back and find the sections still damaged, we'll know for certain that's how they're planning to enter. If they're repaired, we lose the information. She watched him. Was that wrong? Caleb looked at her for a long moment. No, he said, that wasn't wrong. That was exactly right. She exhaled quietly, almost silently, but he saw it. She'd been holding her breath, waiting for his judgment. For one unguarded instant, he saw it, the woman beneath the composure. The one who still wasn't certain she had the right decisions here. The one who was still waiting to find out if this place would accept her or send her away. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "You have good instincts," he said. "Don't wait for me to confirm them every time. Trust them." Something moved in her eyes. Not tears, she wasn't a woman who cried easily, he'd already understood that. But something softer than her usual expression. Something that took a moment to settle back into the calm she wore, like a second skin. "All right," she said. That night, she made coffee after supper, and they sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time since she'd arrived, they didn't talk about the ranch, or the accounts, or the water rights, or Caldwell. He asked her about Kansas, about what her life had looked like before. And she told him not everything, not all at once, but pieces. Her father's medical practice run out of the front room of their house. The families who paid in eggs and labor and sometimes didn't pay at all, and her father never turned them away. The years of watching him work himself into the ground, out of sheer generosity, and her own years of being his shadow, his assistant, his memory when the paperwork overwhelmed him. "You ran things," Caleb said. "Even then, you ran the whole operation." "Someone had to," she said simply. "And when he died, there was nothing left but the knowledge." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Debts he'd forgiven that nobody was going to repay. Equipment that needed replacing. A house that needed a new roof. And me with no way to manage all of it alone. She looked at the table. "I did try for a year. I want you to know that. I tried to make it work in Hartley. But a single woman in a small town with no family and no money is," she stopped. Chose her words. "There are limits to what's possible in that situation. No matter how hard you work, so you wrote to the agency." "So I wrote to the agency," she looked up, "and you wrote back." "I didn't write back. The agency sent me your, I know how it works," she said, and the corner of her mouth went up, just slightly. "I just meant you chose, out of however many names they gave you." He was quiet for a moment. "2 sentences," he said. She tilted her head. "You wrote 2 sentences in your own hand that they included with your file," he said. "About not looking for rescue, about looking for ground worth standing on." He paused. "That's why." Clara was very still. "Most people write what they think you want to hear," he said. "You wrote what was true." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "I almost didn't include it. I thought it would sound strange." "It sounded like a real person," Caleb said. "I hadn't read anything in a long time that sounded like a real person." The lamp burned low between them and neither of them moved to turn it up. It was the most honest conversation Caleb Morgan had had with another human being in 4 years, and he knew it, and the knowledge of it sat in his chest like warmth and like terror simultaneously, and he didn't say any of that out loud. But he suspected, looking at Clara's face, that she felt something similar and was managing it the same way he was, by keeping very still and not naming it. 3 days later, Victor Caldwell came to call. Caleb was in the yard when the carriage arrived. Not a working man's wagon, a proper carriage, black lacquered, pulled by 2 matched bays that cost more than most men in Red Hollow earned in a year. Caldwell himself climbed out with the unhurried movement of a man who had never needed to rush for anything, because everything had always waited for him. He was 60, perhaps 62. Silver-haired, well-dressed, with the particular confidence of wealth that had never been seriously threatened. "Caleb," he said, with the warm tone of a man greeting someone he was planning to bury. "Good morning, Victor." Caleb didn't move toward him. "You're a long way from your property." "Just passing through." Caldwell's eyes moved across the yard with a proprietorial ease that made Caleb's jaw tighten. "I heard you'd taken a wife, wanted to offer my congratulations in person." "She's not my wife yet. Soon enough, I imagine." Caldwell smiled. "The agency arrangement. Novel approach, Caleb, I have to say. A man of your standing. What do you want, Victor?" Caldwell clasped his hands behind his back only to talk. Man to man, about the Dalton Agreement, there it was. In the open, finally. "The Dalton Agreement is my business," Caleb said. "Of course it is, right up until it lapses." He tilted his head. "Edwin Dalton is an old man. His son wants to sell. You know that as well as I do. And when that land moves, Whoever holds the adjoining water rights. The water rights are mine, Caleb said. Today they are, Caldwell said pleasantly. I'm simply suggesting that a renegotiation might benefit everyone. I'm prepared to offer you a very reasonable number for an easement. Just access, Caleb, not ownership. Doesn't that seem like a fair compromise? It wasn't a compromise. It was the first step in a very old playbook. Get the easement, use the easement, incrementally expand the use. Then argue that the original agreement is unenforceable. Caleb had seen it done to 3 other ranchers in the territory. No, Caleb said. Something shifted behind Caldwell's eyes. Just briefly. Then the pleasant expression returned. I understand, he said. These things take consideration. I won't push. He looked past Caleb's shoulder then, and his expression changed a subtle recalibration, the way a man looks when he spotted a new variable in a problem he thought he'd solved. Is that Mrs. Morgan? He said. Caleb turned. Clara was standing at the edge of the yard, maybe 15 feet back. He hadn't heard her come out. She was holding a stack of papers against her chest documents, it looked like, and she was watching Caldwell with an expression that was entirely neutral and entirely alert at the same time. Miss Whitmore, Caleb said. Clara stepped forward without hesitation. Mr. Caldwell, she said, with the kind of tone that implied she'd heard his name before and had formed conclusions. A long ride from your property. Caldwell recovered smoothly. Miss Whitmore, I was just telling Caleb I came to offer my congratulations. That's kind, Clara said. And to discuss the Dalton Water Agreement, I believe. A pause. Caleb keeps you well informed, Caldwell said. I keep myself informed, Clara said. I've read through the current easement terms and the renewal clauses. The original agreement is quite clear on the exclusivity provisions. She looked at him without blinking. I imagine you've read them too. Something moved in Caldwell's expression that wasn't quite respect but was adjacent to it. And underneath that, something else, something sharper. You've read the agreement, he said. I've read everything relevant to this property, she said. Including the deed history, including the survey records from 1871. She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. It was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Caldwell. It was a dismissal, delivered with perfect courtesy, and they all 3 understood it. Caldwell looked at Caleb. Then he smiled, not warmly. Caleb, he said. He walked back to his carriage, climbed in, and was gone. The yard was quiet. Caleb turned to Clara. Where did you find the deed history from 1871? Your father's papers, she said, in the wooden box in the office. I hope you don't mind. I was looking for anything related to the property boundaries, and I found a set of original documents that I don't think your lawyer has ever seen. Caleb stared at her. What kind of documents? She held out the papers she was carrying. The kind, she said, that proved the water access on the East Creek was established as a primary right, not a secondary one. Which means Caldwell's easement argument collapses completely if he ever tries to make it legally. He took the papers slowly. He looked at them. He looked at her. Clara, he said. I know, she said. It's a lot. I can explain everything. How did you know what you were looking for? She paused. Because I've seen this before. My father, the families he helped. This is exactly the kind of thing that gets missed, because nobody looks at the old records. Everyone assumes the current agreement is all there is. She watched him carefully. Are you angry? He thought about it. He genuinely thought about it, standing there with his father's papers in his hands. And then he said, the only thing I'm angry about is that these have been sitting in that box for 20 years, and nobody looked at them. Clara let out a breath. Then we need to get these to your lawyer in Cheyenne as soon as possible. I'll ride tomorrow. Take the originals, she said. Keep copies here. I know how to handle documents, he said, but there was no real edge in it. And then after a pause, did you copy them already? She almost smiled. Last night, there in the kitchen drawer. He looked at her, and for one unguarded moment, he didn't try to manage what was on his face. He just let her see. Whatever was there, the gratitude and the surprise and the complicated, inconvenient warmth that kept breaking through his defenses, no matter how carefully he maintained them. "Thank you," he said. "Just that. You don't need to thank me," she said. "This is my home too." And then she walked back inside, as calm as if she'd said something ordinary. Caleb stood in the yard alone, holding his father's papers, and he thought about those words for a very long time. The week that followed moved fast and sharp. He rode to Cheyenne and spent a full day with his lawyer, a meticulous man named Arthur Peel, who went pale when he saw the 1,871 documents, and then went red, with a mixture of excitement and professional embarrassment that he struggled to contain. "Where did these come from?" Arthur said more than once. "How did nobody find these?" And Caleb said, simply, "Someone looked." He came back from Cheyenne in the evening and found Clara at the kitchen table. She looked up not all at once. She looked up when he came in. She read his face immediately. Another thing she did, that quick, fluent reading of whatever he was feeling that he'd never asked her to do and couldn't seem to stop. "The lawyer thinks we're protected," she said. It wasn't a question. "He thinks we're more than protected," Caleb said. "He thinks if Caldwell makes any move on the water rights now, we have grounds to challenge the northern easements he's been building for the past decade." He sat down. "Arthur wants to send copies to the Territorial Land Office this week." Clara folded her hands on the table. "Caldwell won't like that." "No," Caleb agreed. "He won't, which means he'll stop being careful." The words landed between them with weight, because they both understood what they meant. Careful men with money were dangerous. Careless men with money were something worse. "I need you to be cautious," Caleb said, "while this is happening. I need you to—" "I'm not going to hide in the house, Caleb. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to be careful." She met his eyes. "There's a difference," she said. "I understand the difference." He held her gaze. "Do you?" Something flashed in her eyes, pride, and something beneath pride. Something more complicated. "I have been careful my entire life," she said very quietly. "I have been careful because there was never anyone else to be careful for me. I know what careful looks like." A pause. "What you're really asking is whether I'll do something reckless to prove something to myself or to you." She held his gaze. "And the answer is no. I have nothing to prove to either of us." It was the longest sentence she'd said in one breath since she arrived, and the force of it sat in the room long after she'd finished. "All right," Caleb said. "All right," she agreed. But that night, after she'd gone to her room and the house was quiet, Caleb sat by the window and felt, for the first time, something he hadn't felt since Margaret, the specific, acute fear of losing something he'd let himself value. Not the ranch, not the water rights, not the land. Her. He pressed that feeling down fast and hard, the way you press a wound before it can bleed. He told himself it was too soon. He told himself he was a practical man. He told himself 100 things that all added up to the same thing, which was that he was terrified, and terror had never stopped anything from being true. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. The cattle were quiet. The ranch breathed around him the way it always had. But it felt different now, and he knew it. And somewhere in the knowing he understood that there was no going back to the man he'd been when that stagecoach arrived. That man was already gone. The calm after Caldwell's visit lasted exactly 11 days. Caleb counted them later, looking back. 11 days in which the ranch ran the way it was supposed to run, in which the documents sat safely with Arthur Peel in Cheyenne, in which the fence lines stayed intact, and the cattle moved undisturbed, and Clara made coffee in the mornings, and they sat across from each other and talked about things that mattered, and some things that didn't, and Caleb let himself believe, briefly and dangerously, that the hard part was over. He should have known better. Men like Victor Caldwell didn't walk away from a negotiating table. They simply changed what they were negotiating with. The first sign came from town, and it came through Eliza. She arrived on a Wednesday morning with preserves she didn't need to deliver personally, and a look on her face that told Caleb she'd come with something else entirely. Clara was out checking the east fence with Martinez, a habit she'd developed in the past 2 weeks. The kind of systematic attention to the property's vulnerabilities that Caleb had stopped noticing, because he'd stopped expecting anyone to share that attention with him. Eliza sat at the kitchen table and got to it immediately. "People are talking," she said. "People always talk," Caleb said. "Not like this," she folded her hands. "Caldwell's been in town." "Not himself, he doesn't do things himself, you know that. But his foreman Garrett has been making rounds. The saloon, the general store, Mrs. Patterson's shop." She paused. "He's been asking questions about Clara." Caleb went very still. "What kind of questions?" "The kind you ask when you're trying to find something wrong with someone." Eliza met his eyes. Her family, her father's practice, whether there were debts, whether the agency she came through is reputable, whether she stopped. Whether what? Eliza's voice was careful now. Whether she's really who she says she is. The kitchen was quiet. "He's trying to discredit her," Caleb said. His voice came out flat and cold. "He's trying to find a crack," Eliza said. "Because those documents she found closed the door on the water rights argument. And he knows it, and now he's looking for another door." She reached across the table and put her hand briefly on Caleb's arm. "You need to warn her." He warned her that evening. Clara listened without interrupting. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her face composed, and she listened to everything he said about Garrett, about the questions, about Caldwell's pattern of behavior. When Caleb finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What has he found?" she said. "I don't know yet. He'll find the debts," she said, and her voice didn't change. Just stayed level. "My father owed money to 3 different suppliers when he died. I paid what I could. There's still an outstanding amount with a pharmacy in Hartley that I haven't been able to settle." She looked at Caleb directly. "I wasn't hiding that. I simply hadn't found the right moment to say it." "How much?" $42. It was not 42,000. It was not catastrophic. But Caleb understood immediately why she was bracing, because in Caldwell's hands, $42 of debt attached to her father's name could be made to look like anything. Could be made to look like dishonesty, like concealment. Like a woman who had come to Wyoming running from something. "I'll pay it," Caleb said. Clara looked at him sharply. "You will not. It's $42. Clara, it is my debt," she said, and the quiet force behind those 4 words stopped him completely. "It is the last thing I owe for my father's life, and I will settle it myself. I have almost enough saved." A pause. "But I need you to understand that Caldwell will use it regardless. Paying it doesn't erase his ability to point at it." "I know that. So what do we do?" Caleb thought. "We don't hide from it. If it comes out through us, not through him." He held her gaze. "I won't let him control the story." Something moved in Clara's expression, something complicated and layered and real. She nodded once, slowly, and then she said something he didn't expect. "Does it change anything, for you, knowing about the debt?" The question cost her something. He could hear it, the way her voice stayed steady, but her eyes didn't quite. She was asking whether she'd lost ground, whether the thing she'd tried to protect had broken anyway. "No," he said. She held his gaze. "You didn't hesitate." "Because it didn't require thought," he said. "A debt is something that happened. It's not who you are." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her hands and nodded again, and this time, something in the set of her shoulders released just slightly, just enough. They didn't say anything else about it that night. But something had moved between them, some additional layer of trust laid down, the way you lay down stones across a river carefully, deliberately, each one tested before the next is placed. What neither of them knew was that Caldwell hadn't stopped at the pharmacy debt. He'd gone back further. The knock came 3 days later, in the early afternoon, and it wasn't Caldwell or Garrett. It was a man Caleb didn't recognize, middle-aged, traveling clothes, the look of someone who'd ridden hard and was trying not to show it. He introduced himself as Frank Aldridge, from Hartley, Kansas. He asked for Clara. Caleb stood in the doorway. "What's your business with her?" "It's personal," Aldridge said, "from before she came here." Everything in Caleb's chest tightened. "Wait here." He found Clara in the kitchen and said a man from Hartley was at the door, asking for her, and watched her face. She went still in a way that was different from her usual composure. This was not calm. This was the look of someone who had been hoping a particular door would stay closed and had just heard the handle turn. "What's his name?" she said. "Frank Aldridge." She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then opened them. "I'll speak with him." Caleb stepped back from the doorway, but he didn't go far. He wasn't going to pretend he did. Frank Aldridge came inside and took off his hat and looked at Clara with an expression that mixed guilt and relief in roughly equal measure. "Clara," he said, "I'm sorry to come like this." "Then why did you?" she said. "Because someone reached out to people back in Hartley," he said. "Someone asking about you, about your father, about the Whitmore family." He glanced at Caleb, then back. "I figured you'd want to know what they were being told." "And what were they being told?" Clara said quietly. Aldridge turned his hat in his hands. "That your father's practice wasn't legitimate. That he wasn't licensed properly in the last 2 years before he died." The room went completely silent. Caleb looked at Clara. Her face had gone very careful. "That is not true," she said. "I know it's not true," Aldridge said quickly. "Your father was the most decent man in Hartley for 30 years. But the licensing records, from those 2 years, there was a clerical error in the county office. His renewal was filed, but it was recorded under a different name. Someone must have found that." He paused. "The way it looks on paper, without the original filing receipt." "I have the filing receipt," Clara said. Aldridge blinked. "You do? I have everything," she said. "Every record. Every filing. Every payment my father ever made." Her voice was absolutely steady now, but her hands, Caleb noticed, were pressed flat against the table. "Because I knew that someday someone might try to make him look like something he wasn't. So I kept everything." Aldridge let out a long breath. He shook his head. "That's fortunate, because the way Caldwell's man was talking about it." "How do you know it was Caldwell's man?" Caleb said. Aldridge looked at him. "Because he wasn't subtle about who he was working for." He looked back at Clara. "I came because you were good to my family, Clara. When my wife was sick and your father came 3 miles in a January storm, because nobody else would. I figured I owed you this." He stood. "I'm sorry I can't do more." After Aldridge left, Caleb turned to Clara, and she was already moving toward the office, toward the wooden box where she kept her documents. He followed her and watched her pull out a smaller leather folder he hadn't seen before, worn soft with age and handling. She opened it on the desk and found what she was looking for in under a minute. A single piece of paper. A county filing receipt with a date and a clerk's stamp, and her father's name spelled correctly. She held it up. "It's enough," Caleb said. "Is it?" For the first time since he'd known her, her voice had an edge that wasn't composure. It was anger, clean, controlled, directed anger, because he'll find something else. And then something else after that. He's not going to stop, Caleb. He doesn't care about my father's license. He doesn't care about the debt. He's digging until he finds something that sticks. And if he doesn't find something real, he'll find something that looks real. Then we need to move before he gets another chance to dig, Caleb said. She looked at him. How? He'd been thinking about it since the moment Eliza sat down at his kitchen table 3 days ago. "Arthur Peel," he said. "The documents about the water rights are enough to open a legal challenge. If we go to the Territorial Land Office ourselves proactively and put what we have on record, Caldwell loses the ability to maneuver quietly. He has to move in the open, and men like Caldwell are only dangerous in the dark," Clara said slowly. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "And what about what he's doing to my reputation here?" Caleb paused. Then he said the thing he'd been thinking but hadn't found the way to say yet. "Let me handle that, Caleb. Not by fighting it," he said. "By letting the town see what's real." He held her gaze. "They already are. Martinez, Eliza, they see it. I need to stop being quiet about what I see." Clara looked at him for a long measuring moment. Something in her expression shifted, not melted, not collapsed. Something more structural than that. One of the foundational assumptions she'd walked into this ranch, with the assumption that she would have to prove herself alone. That no one would stand in front of anything on her behalf rearranged itself quietly. "All right," she said. "All right," he said back. And then, before he could think better of it, he took the filing receipt from her hand and said, "I'll ride to Cheyenne tomorrow." Both sets of documents together. She let him take it. That, more than anything, told him where they stood. What happened next happened fast. Arthur Peel worked through the weekend. By Monday, he had filed papers with the Territorial Land Office that challenged the legal validity of Caldwell's easement applications on 3 neighboring properties, citing the 1871 primary rights document as precedent. It was not the final word. Legal things were never the final word immediately. But it was a public move, a recorded move, and it meant that anything Caldwell did next happened in daylight. Caleb came back from Cheyenne on Tuesday to find his ranch transformed by what he could only describe as organized siege. Martinez had doubled the fence checks. Deke had reorganized the watch rotations so there were always 2 men on the north boundary overnight. Bo, the 17-year-old kid who couldn't read 2 weeks ago, had appointed himself Clara's unofficial shadow whenever Caleb wasn't on the property, trailing her at a respectful distance with the absolute seriousness of someone who had decided a person was worth protecting and was going to do it properly. Caleb stood in the yard and watched all of this and felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut for years. These were his men. This was his ranch. And they were doing all of this because Clara had treated every one of them like a person worth knowing, and they remembered it, and they were returning it. He found Clara in the kitchen, the men he started. "I know," she said. She was at the stove, and she didn't turn around. "They've been rearranging themselves all day. I told Martinez he didn't have to." "They want to," Caleb said. "Let them." She went quiet. He heard her exhale. "Ari said." She turned around then. Her eyes were dry, but the expression on her face was the most unguarded he'd ever seen it, raw at the edges, in a way that her composure usually prevented. "I'm not accustomed," she said carefully, "to people making decisions to be on my side." He held her gaze. "Get accustomed to it." She looked at him for a long moment, then looked back at the stove. "Dinner will be ready in an hour," she said, in a voice that was working hard to be ordinary. Caleb went to wash up and said nothing else, because sometimes the most important thing is knowing when words are the smaller gesture. Caldwell's response came on Thursday. It didn't come as a legal filing. It didn't come as another visit. It came through the mouth of every gossiping channel Red Hollow had to offer, and it was more sophisticated than Caleb had expected because it bypassed the facts entirely and went straight for the feeling. The story, as it traveled through town, went like this. Clara Whitmore had come to Wyoming under false pretenses. She was not simply a practical woman looking for a new start. She was a woman who had spent years managing a fraudulent medical practice, who had fled Hartley ahead of creditors, and who had attached herself to Caleb Morgan, specifically because she knew about the water rights dispute and saw an opportunity. She wasn't a bride, she was a scheme. It was elegant in the way that the most damaging lies always are built around just enough real detail to sound credible. The debt was real, the licensing discrepancy was real. The timing of her arrival, relative to the Caldwell dispute, was real. Everything that was actually innocent looked, in the arrangement of the story, like evidence. Caleb heard it from Thomas, who heard it at the feed store and came directly to the Morgan Ranch, still wearing his work coat. Tight-jawed and furious in the contained way Thomas furious when he was trying hard not to do something destructive. "I want to go over there," Thomas said. "You won't," Caleb said. Caleb's voice was quiet and flat. "That's what he wants. He wants us reacting. He wants emotion." He paused. "We're not going to give him emotion." Thomas looked at him. "Does Clara know?" "Not yet. She needs to know." "I know she does," he told her that evening. Directly, honestly, everything, the full shape of the story Caldwell was circulating, every detail, without softening it. She deserved to know the exact thing she was walking into when she went to town next. She deserved not to be ambushed by it. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she was very still, and then she set down the cup she was holding and looked at the table for a moment and said nothing. "Clara," he said. "Give me a minute," she said. He gave her the minute. When she looked up, her face had gone through something and come out the other side. The rawness he'd seen earlier in the week was gone. What was there now was something harder and cleaner and very certain. "He made a mistake," she said. Caleb waited. "He tried to take away what I built here," she said. "Not the water rights, not the legal case. This," she gestured at the kitchen, at the house, at the ranch beyond it. "He thinks if he makes the town believe I'm not real, it unmakes me." Her voice was level, but it had iron in it now. "But the thing is, I am real. Every single thing I've done here is real. Bo can read the feed chart now. Martinez's wife got the medicine she needed because I knew who to write to in Cheyenne. Deke trusts his own judgment slightly more than he did a month ago because someone took the time to tell him his experience was worth something." She looked directly at Caleb. "He can't take that back. None of that unhappens because he told a story about it." Caleb looked at her. He thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 5 weeks ago with one bag and 2 sentences, and a kind of quiet certainty that he'd recognized without being able to name. He thought about the word she had used. This. She had gestured at this place and called it hers without hesitating. "No," he said, "it doesn't. So what do we do?" she said. "We go to town tomorrow," he said, "together, and we let them look." Clara's chin lifted a fraction. "You think that's enough?" "I think the truth is enough when you're not hiding from it," he said. She studied him. "Are you doing this for the ranch or for me?" He held her gaze without flinching. "Both," he said. "And I'm not ashamed of either." Something shifted in her expression, deep and sudden and quick to be controlled. She nodded. "Tomorrow then," she said. They went to town the following morning. Caleb drove the wagon himself. Clara sat beside him on the bench, not behind him in the wagon bed, the way a woman who was trying not to be noticed would sit beside him where a partner sat. She wore her good dress, and her hair was neat, and she held her folder of documents in her lap, and she did not look like a woman who was running from anything. Red Hollow responded to their arrival. The way small towns always respond to the thing they've been talking about. Suddenly appearing in person, a complex, visible reorientation. People stopping and watching without quite stopping. Conversations pausing mid-sentence. Mrs. Patterson stood outside her shop and watched with the calculating expression of a woman updating her accounting. Caleb stopped the wagon outside the general store, climbed down, and extended his hand to Clara. She took it and stepped down, and he held her hand for a moment longer. Then was strictly necessary to help her from the wagon, and in that moment he felt her squeeze his hand once. Briefly, a small, private signal that cost her nothing and meant everything. They walked into the general store together. Frank Henley, who owned it and had lived in Red Hollow for 30 years, and was the closest thing the town had to an arbiter of public opinion, looked up from behind the counter. He was 60-something, weathered, honest, in the blunt way of men who'd stopped having patience for performance. "Caleb," he said, and then to Clara, "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Henley," Clara said. "I wanted to introduce myself properly, since I'll be placing regular supply orders, and it seemed right to do it in person." Henley looked at her. "You're the one who found the old water rights documents," he said. "I went through the property records." "Yes," she said. "Heard some other things too," Henley said. And his voice was neutral enough that it could have gone any direction. "I imagine you have," Clara said, matching his tone exactly. "If there's anything specific you'd like to ask me about, I'll answer it. I don't have anything to hide, and I don't intend to pretend otherwise." The store was not empty. There were 4 other people in it, all of whom were suddenly very interested in things that did not require their eyes. Henley studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "My wife died in 1871. I know what a man looks like who's been alone too long." He glanced at Caleb briefly. and I know what a man looks like when something's changed." He turned back to Clara. "What do you need for your first supply order?" Clara pulled out a list she'd prepared. It was organized, detailed, and practical. Henley read through it without expression and then began pulling items from the shelves, and the transaction was conducted with the businesslike ease of two people who understood each other's language. After they left the store, Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then that was the first vote. It was one man, Clara said. "Henley is the whole conversation," Caleb said. "In 2 days, what he thinks becomes what the town thinks." Clara absorbed this. Then she said, "I didn't know he was a widower. Most people don't mention it." But he recognized something. She looked at the street ahead of them. "Loneliness has a particular posture," she said quietly. "Once you know it, you see it everywhere." Caleb thought about that for the rest of the ride home. And he thought about the fact that she would know what that posture looked like because she had worn it herself. And something about that thought made the familiar ache in his chest shift into something with less grief in it and more weight, the weight of another person's reality pressing against his, solid and undeniable. The second vote came from a direction neither of them expected. That same evening, Reverend Hayes arrived at the Morgan Ranch. Caleb answered the door, and the Reverend in his good coat with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and resolute at the same time. "May I speak with Miss Whitmore?" he said. Caleb called Clara, and she came from the kitchen and looked at the Reverend and waited. "I owe you an apology," Hayes said. "I listened to things I shouldn't have, and I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. And I let my silence stand in for something it wasn't." He looked at her steadily. "I've known Caleb Morgan for 15 years. He is not a man who is easily fooled. And I should have started from that fact instead of from gossip." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You're not obligated to support me, Reverend," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I am obligated to be honest. And the honest thing is that I came out here this evening because Frank Henley called me an old fool who was letting one rich man poison the whole well." He had the grace to look somewhat embarrassed by this. "I thought I should see for myself. And what do you see?" Clara said. He looked at her. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the house behind them, at the lamp burning in the kitchen, at the general lived-in evidence of two people building something together. "I see exactly what Frank said I'd see," he said. Clara's expression moved through something complicated and came out quiet. "Thank you," she said. "If you'd like to be married in the church," Hayes said, glancing between them, with the restrained subtlety of a man dropping a boulder, "the offer stands." Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at Caleb. Neither of them had specifically discussed marriage. The arrangement had existed in a careful middle space where the word was implied but not yet spoken. "We'll discuss it," Caleb said, which was as definitive as he'd ever been about anything personal in his life. Hayes nodded, satisfied, and left. The door closed. Caleb turned. Clara was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen before, one part amusement, one part something so much more serious that it quietly overtook the amusement. "We'll discuss it," she repeated. "Is that—" He stopped. He looked at her. He was not, he realized, a man who knew how to do this gracefully, and she deserved better than clumsy. But she also deserved honesty more than she deserved elegance. And so he said, "I know this isn't what either of us planned for it to become. But I'm not sure anymore that what I planned matters much against what it is." Clara held his gaze. "What is it?" she said quietly. Genuinely asking. "Something real," he said. "Whatever comes next, whatever Caldwell does, whatever the town says, whatever happens to the water rights or the property or any of it, this is something real. And I don't want to manage it at arm's length anymore." She stood very still. And then she said, in the most unguarded voice he'd ever heard from her, "I came here prepared to work for a life." "I wasn't prepared for this." "Neither was I," he said. She looked at him for a long time. The lamp flickered. Somewhere outside, a horse moved in the stable and was quiet again. "Ask me properly," she said. "When you're ready, don't manage it. Just ask me." "I will," he said. And then something Caldwell had done, something none of them knew about, yet arrived in the night and changed everything. The noise came at 2 in the morning. Caleb heard at first the specific, terrible sound of cattle in distress, too many animals moving wrong. The warning in it that every rancher learns to hear in his sleep and never forgets. He was dressed and out the door in under a minute. Clara was right behind him. "Go back inside," he said. "No," she said, and she was already moving toward the barn. The north fence was down, not weakened down, 3 sections of it cut clean, and a portion of the herd was moving through the gap toward the open land beyond. In the dark, in the cold, with the wind coming from the wrong direction, rounding them back was going to take every man on the property and more. Deke was already shouting orders. Martinez had a lantern. Bo was saddling horses with the furious efficiency of someone running on pure adrenaline. Caleb turned to find Clara not standing still, not watching. She had taken a lantern from the hook by the barn door and was walking toward the gap in the fence with it, using the light to push the lead animals back from the opening. Using her body and the lantern and her voice calm and steady, and carrying to the front edge of the movement before it became a full rout. She'd never worked cattle. She shouldn't have known to do that. But she'd watched everything on this ranch for 5 weeks with those clear, attentive eyes, and she'd learned. And now she was standing in the dark gap of a cut fence, using everything she'd learned, and it was working. Caleb stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then Deke said, "Boss," and Caleb moved. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of riding and shouting and lantern light and cold that got into the hands and didn't leave. They recovered all but 7 head. 7 out of the portion that had broken through, which, considering the darkness and the terrain and the deliberate intent behind the fence cut, was nothing short of extraordinary. When it was over, when the hands were settling the cattle and checking the other fence lines by torchlight, Caleb found Clara standing at the edge of the yard. Her dress was muddy, her hair had come half down. She was breathing hard in the cold air, her breath fogging, her hands dirty. She looked at him. He crossed the yard and stopped a foot from her, and looked at her face, at the mud and the exhaustion, and the absolute, undefeated resolve in her eyes. And he felt something shift in him so completely, and finally, that it was almost physical. The wall he'd been maintaining for 4 years, the careful, disciplined, constructed wall that he'd told himself was self-preservation, and was actually just fear it didn't fall. It didn't crumble, it simply became unnecessary. "You turned the lead animals," he said. "I watched you do it last week," she said. "I know." He paused. "Are you hurt?" "No." She pushed the loose hair back from her face with her wrist. 7 head. 7 head, he agreed. "Caldwell sent someone," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze in the cold dark. "Then we finish this." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he'd been carefully not fully looking for 5 weeks. And what he saw was not the woman he hadn't expected when that stagecoach door opened. What he saw was exactly who she'd been from the first moment. A person who was not looking for rescue, and was not going to be managed, and was not going to break, and was going to stand in the gap of a cut fence in the middle of the night and turn the herd back with a lantern and her voice, because it was her ranch, her herd, her home, and she was not going to let any of it go without a fight. "Yes," he said, "we finish this." Neither of them moved back toward the house just yet. They stood in the cold and the dark, with the sound of the cattle settling and the lanterns moving through the field, and the enormous quiet, certain knowledge of what they were to each other settling around them like a second warmth. Caldwell had cut the fence, trying to make Caleb feel alone and vulnerable. He had done the opposite. And tomorrow, everything would be different. They didn't sleep that night. Not really. After the fence was temporarily secured, and the hands had done what could be done until morning, Caleb and Clara came back into the house and sat at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them and the kind of silence that wasn't empty, that was full of everything that had just happened, and everything that was still coming, and everything that neither of them had said yet, but both of them knew was there. Deke knocked on the door just after 4 in the morning. He came in without being asked, the way a man does when he's been with someone long enough to know when formality is the wrong register entirely. He sat down heavily in the third chair, put his hat on the table, and looked at both of them. 3 sections cut, he said. Clean cuts. Somebody knew where to go, and they knew how to do it fast and quiet. He looked at Caleb. This wasn't a warning. This was a test. Testing what? Clara said. Deke looked at her. In the weeks since she'd arrived, the look had changed from proprietary skepticism to something much closer to plain respect. Testing how fast we can respond, how well we're organized. Whether we panic, he paused. Caldwell's getting ready to make a real move. Something legal. He needed to know whether we'd be distracted and scrambling when he did it. How long do we have? Caleb said. Days, Deke said. Not weeks. Clara's hands wrapped around her cup. Then we need Arthur Peel in Red Hollow, not in Cheyenne. Here, where he can move immediately when whatever comes, comes. Caleb looked at her. I can send a rider at first light. Send 2, she said, in different directions, in case someone's watching the road. Deke stared at her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb with an expression that said, plainly and without any of the words it was replacing, that he understood now why Caleb Morgan had stopped being a ghost. Caleb sent 2 riders at first light. Arthur Peel arrived the following afternoon, dusty and alert, and carrying a leather case that looked like it had been through everything the Wyoming Territory had to offer. He sat at the kitchen table. It had become the war room. Caleb thought, looking at the maps and papers spread across it, and went through everything. The 1,871 documents, the easement filings, the fence destruction, the timeline of Caldwell's movements. Arthur listened. He made notes. He asked precise, rapid questions that Clara answered as often as Caleb did, and after the 3rd time this happened, Arthur looked up at her, over his reading glasses, and said, Miss Whitmore, did you study law? No, she said. I studied necessity. Arthur considered this. Close enough, he said, and went back to his notes. What Arthur told them was this. Caldwell had filed a complaint with the Territorial Land Office 2 days before the fence was cut. The complaint challenged the validity of the 1,871 primary rights document on the grounds that the original survey it referenced had never been formally registered. It was a technical argument, the kind that most ranchers wouldn't be able to counter because they wouldn't even understand what was being challenged. But if it stood, it would void the water rights protection entirely, and once that protection was void, Caldwell's easement applications on the neighboring properties could be used to effectively surround and control the Morgan Ranch's access to water within a single season. Can he win that argument? Caleb said. Arthur was quiet for a moment. On the face of the complaint, it has merit. The 1,871 survey registration is ambiguous. He paused. But there is a counter-argument. If the original survey can be tied to the territorial land grant records from 1,869, which predates the registration requirement, then the complaint collapses. The question is whether those 1,869 records still exist, and whether they can be produced in time. How much time? Clara said. The land office has scheduled a review hearing for 12 days from now, Arthur said. In Cheyenne, 12 days. Caleb looked at the table. He looked at the maps. He looked at the sheer scope of what Caldwell had built, years of preparation, layers of legal architecture, carefully positioned pieces that were now all moving at once. The 1,869 records, Clara said. She said it slowly. The way she said things when she was working through something. Those would be territorial records, held by the government. The Territorial Secretary's office in Cheyenne, Arthur confirmed. Are they accessible? Technically, yes. Practically, Arthur pressed his lips together. Those records are 30 years old. The filing system in those years was inconsistent at best. Finding a specific land grant record in 12 days would require someone who knows exactly what they're looking for and how those records were organized. My father handled territorial land documents for 15 years, Clara said. Everyone at the table went very still. He worked with the filing conventions of the 1860s and 1870s. He taught me those systems. She looked at Arthur. I know how they organized those records. I know the cross-referencing system they used before the standardization in 1875. Arthur took his glasses off and looked at her. You're telling me you can find that record? I'm telling you, I have a better chance of finding it in 12 days than anyone else in this room, she said. Possibly better than anyone else in the territory. Caleb looked at her. She held his gaze steadily, and he understood that she was not overstating her confidence. Clara Whitmore did not overstate anything. If she said she could do it, she believed she could do it, and her belief was built on the same foundation as everything else she'd done since she arrived. Actual knowledge, carefully accumulated, applied with precision. Then you go to Cheyenne, he said. We go to Cheyenne, she said. Arthur needs to be there for the legal arguments. You need to be there, because Caldwell will try to make a side offer if he thinks the hearing might not go his way. And I need to be there for the records. Arthur was already repacking his case. I'll wire ahead to arrange access to the secretary's office. Tell them we need access, starting tomorrow morning, Clara said. Caleb looked at her. We leave tonight? We leave in 2 hours, she said. While Caldwell thinks he has more time than he does. Thomas came over that evening as they were preparing to leave and stood in the yard with his arms crossed, looking at the wagon being loaded, and said to Caleb in a low voice, You understand this woman is extraordinary. I'm aware, Caleb said. I mean genuinely extraordinary. Not just capable, not just smart, the specific combination of things she is. Thomas, I just want you to not be an idiot about it, Thomas said. You have a pattern of not saying things until it's nearly too late, and I'm asking you, as someone who loves you like a brother, to break that pattern before it actually is too late. Caleb looked at him. It's not going to be too late. How do you know? He paused. He thought about the night before the cut fence, the dark, the cattle moving wrong, and Clara standing in the gap with a lantern. He thought about 12 days and 30-year-old records, and a woman who had learned the filing conventions of territorial land offices. Because her father had thought knowledge was its own form of safety. Because she's still here, he said, and she knows exactly what she's doing. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. Don't waste it, he said. They rode through the night. Arthur slept in the wagon bed. Caleb drove. Clara sat beside him on the bench, wrapped in her coat, and for the first 2 hours neither of them spoke much. The land moved past them in darkness and cold, and the rhythm of the horses kept its own kind of time. Tell me about Margaret, Clara said, around the second hour. He looked at her. She was looking forward at the road. You don't have to, she said, but I'd like to know. Not to compare. I'm not asking so I can measure myself against her. I'm asking because she was real to you, and I think I should know the real things. He thought about that for a moment. Then he talked. He told her about meeting Margaret at 19, at a dance in a town he'd been passing through with a cattle drive, and had stopped in for exactly one evening. How she'd laughed at something he'd said, and he'd immediately said 3 more foolish things, trying to hear the laugh again. How she'd understood ranching, instinctively grew up on one, could ride and work, and read weather, and so there had never been the distance between them that he'd seen in other marriages, where one person lived outdoors, and one person lived inside, and they met at the end of the day like 2 people from different countries. How she had died on a Tuesday morning in November, fast and wrong, from a fever that should have been survivable, that would have been survivable if the doctor hadn't been a day's ride away. How he had sat in the room afterward and understood, for the first time in his adult life, what it meant to have the ground removed from under you. He talked for almost an hour. Clara listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, She sounds like someone who was exactly right for who you were at 25. He looked at her. That's not a small thing, she said quickly. I don't mean it as a small thing. I mean she paused, choosing. You were a young man building something. She was exactly the right person for that building. And I think she made you into the man who built what you built. Another pause. But the man who built it is older now, and what he actually needs, might be different. You mean you, he said. I mean someone who can stand beside what already exists, she said. Not someone who's building alongside you. Someone who can see what you've already built and say, this is worth protecting. This is worth fighting for. This is already whole. She turned to look at him then, directly. Margaret built with you. I'm not here to build. I'm not sure I have the right word for it. Stay, he said. She was quiet. The word is stay, he said. That's what I need. Someone who's made the decision to stay. Clara looked at him for a long time in the moving dark. I've made it, she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a performance. It was simply the truth, said plainly, by someone who only said true things. And it landed in Caleb's chest, with the weight of everything. It was not a beginning, but a confirmation. Not a new feeling, but a named one. He reached across the bench and took her hand. She let him. They rode the rest of the way to Cheyenne like that, in the dark and the cold, with the horses moving steadily forward, and the stars very bright above the open land, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said. They arrived in Cheyenne before dawn. Arthur went directly to his office to prepare the legal response to Caldwell's complaint. Caleb arranged rooms at the hotel nearest the territorial secretary's office. Clara slept for 3 hours and was at the secretary's door when it opened at 8 in the morning. What followed was 4 days of methodical, focused, exhausting archival work Clara had ever done, and she had done plenty. The 1,869 records were exactly as disorganized as Arthur had warned, decades of imperfect filing, inconsistent cross-referencing, documents misfiled under adjacent dates, or neighboring property descriptions. But the system, chaotic as it was a system, and Clara's father had taught her that every system, no matter how broken it appeared, had an internal logic that revealed itself if you were patient enough and systematic enough to look for it. She worked 12-hour days. Caleb brought her food she sometimes forgot to eat. Arthur came in the afternoons to review what she'd found and assess its legal applicability. Caleb sat with her in the evenings, and she talked with her in the evenings, and she talked through what she'd found, and he listened and asked questions that were more useful than he knew, because sometimes the act of explaining something out loud showed you where you'd missed a thread. On the third day she found something that wasn't what she was looking for. She found it in a folder misfiled under a neighboring county's designations, a folder that contained 2 documents. The first was a survey registration from 1,869 that corresponded exactly to the land grant Caleb's father had received. The original survey, predating the registration requirement, recorded in the proper territorial system. The document that Caldwell's complaint claimed didn't exist. She held it for a long time before she moved. Then she found the second document. She read it twice. Then she set it face down on the table and went to find Caleb. He was in the hotel dining room with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and the look of a man who was managing worry by staying very still. He saw her face when she came in and was on his feet before she reached the table. You found it, he said. I found it, she said, but I found something else. She told him about the second document. It was a deed transfer also from 1,869. Transferring a portion of the creekside land that included the primary water source to the Morgan family. Not an easement, not a shared access agreement. An outright transfer recorded before the registration requirements, meaning it predated and superseded every subsequent easement agreement Caldwell had constructed. The water wasn't just protected by Caleb's rights agreement. It was Caleb's, outright, had been since 1,869. Caldwell's entire legal structure, every easement, every neighboring property agreement, every layer of careful positioning he'd built over years, was constructed on the assumption that the water source was shared access. If it was outright ownership, every one of those structures collapsed. He didn't know, Clara said. Caldwell has been playing for something that was never available to him. Because nobody knew this document existed. Caleb stared at her. The complaint he filed with the land office, she said. The hearing in 12 days. He's not just going to lose the argument, Caleb. He's going to reveal that he's spent years attempting to acquire access to something he had no legal claim on. In front of the Territorial Land Office, on record. The silence stretched. Arthur, Caleb said. I know, she said. We need Arthur right now. Arthur Peel, when presented with both documents, sat completely still for 30 seconds. This was, Clara would later tell Eliza, the most visibly stunned she had ever seen a lawyer, and she had seen lawyers react to quite a few things. Then he said, "This changes everything." Yes, Clara said. This doesn't just win the hearing. This potentially opens Caldwell to a challenge on every land arrangement he's made in the valley for the past decade. I know, she said. Arthur looked at her over his glasses with an expression that was equal parts professional admiration and personal astonishment. How did you find this? His system made internal sense once you understood the logic, she said. Once I knew what the system's logic was, I knew where to look for things that didn't fit it. This was misfiled deliberately, I think, or something close to deliberately. Someone pulled it from the main sequence. She paused. 30 years ago, long before Caldwell ever became interested in the valley. Someone who wanted it to stay lost, Caleb said quietly. Or someone who was protecting it, Clara said. I don't know which. I don't know that it matters now. Arthur was already writing. The hearing was scheduled for 6 days out. They had what they needed with 5 days to spare. Caleb sent a writer back to Red Hollow with a letter to Thomas explaining what had been found, and asking him to quietly let DK and Martinez know that the situation had changed in their favor. He sent a second letter to the Dalton family, whose land and water agreement renewal had been the original pressure point, informing them that the basis for any renegotiation had been substantially altered, and that they should make no agreements with any party until the hearing concluded. Then, with 5 days in Cheyenne and nowhere urgently to be, something shifted. Without the desperate archival work filling every hour, without the immediate crisis demanding constant forward motion, the space between Caleb and Clara became something different. Something quieter and more present. They had dinner together 2 evenings in a row at a proper restaurant, not because they planned it as a romantic occasion, but because they were hungry and in the same city, and it was natural, and the naturalness of it was its own kind of revelation. Caleb ordered food and asked her opinion, and they disagreed mildly about something inconsequential and laughed about it, and he thought, this is what Margaret had been right about. This is what Thomas had seen from the outside for months that Caleb had been too careful to look at directly. On the 4th evening, walking back from dinner in the cold air, Caleb stopped walking. Clara stopped beside him and looked at him with those clear, patient eyes. I told you I'd ask you properly when I was ready, he said. She became very still. I'm ready, he said. She watched him. He took her hand. He didn't get down on one knee. He was going to be honest about what he was. And he wasn't a man who performed gestures naturally, but he held her hand in both of his, and he looked at her and said it plainly and meant every word. I know this started as an arrangement, he said. I know neither of us planned for it to become what it is. But I'm not interested in managing what it is anymore. I'm not interested in calling it something careful and practical, when what it actually is, what you actually are to me, is the person I want to stand beside for whatever's left of my life. He paused. I am not easy. I know that. I don't talk enough, and I work too much, and I spent 4 years becoming someone who forgot how to be present with another person. But I'm learning. Another pause. You're the reason I'm learning. Clara's eyes had gone bright, though her composure held in the way it always held, the way that was entirely hers. Clara Whitmore, he said, will you stay? She looked at him for a long moment. The cold air moved around them. Somewhere nearby, a horse and carriage passed on the street. And then she said, "I already told you I'd made that decision." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to ask anyway." The corner of her mouth lifted. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Caleb, I'll stay." He held her hand tighter. She let him. They stood there on the Cheyenne Street, in the cold November air, and it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't decorated. It was two people who had been through something real together, acknowledging that the something real wasn't going to stop, and that they didn't want it to. The hearing happened 5 days later. Caleb and Clara sat beside Arthur in the Territorial Land Office hearing room. Caldwell arrived with 2 lawyers and the composed, proprietary confidence of a man who expected to win. He did not win. Arthur presented the 1,869 survey registration first. Caldwell's complaint collapsed on contact. But Arthur didn't stop there. He presented the deed transfer document second, and at that point the room changed. The land office commissioner leaning forward, Caldwell's lawyers conferring in urgent whispers, Caldwell himself going very still, in the particular way of a man who has just realized the ground underneath him is not what he thought it was. The commissioner asked 3 questions. Arthur answered all 3 with documents. The complaint was dismissed. The Morgan water rights were confirmed as primary and absolute. The commissioner noted for the record that the deed transfer document raised questions about several other easement arrangements in the valley that the office would be reviewing independently. Caldwell stood when the commissioner finished speaking. He was controlled. Caleb gave him that. He did not shout or make threats. He looked across the room at Caleb with an expression that had moved through anger and come out the other side into something colder and more permanent. And then his gaze moved to Clara. He looked at her for a long moment. And then he said quietly, "Meant for her. Well done, Miss Whitmore." It was the closest thing to a concession he was capable of. Coming from Victor Caldwell, it was remarkable. Clara met his gaze. "Take care of your people, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Whatever happens to your arrangements, your workers didn't cause it, and they shouldn't suffer for it." Caldwell looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned and walked out. Arthur was shaking both their hands. The commissioner was speaking to his clerk. The lawyers were packing their papers. Caleb looked at Clara. She looked at him. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She exhaled a long, slow exhale that had weeks of tension in it, and he watched it leave her, watched her shoulders come down from where she'd been holding them, watched the particular quality of alertness that had been her constant companion since before the fence was cut, soften into something that was not quite relaxed. She was not a woman who relaxed in the some people did, but quieter. "Present, here, let's go home," she said. They left Cheyenne the next morning. The sky was clear, and the air was cold, and the road back to Red Hollow stretched ahead of them, open and familiar, and entirely different from what it had been 6 days ago. Halfway home, Caleb said, "Thomas is going to be insufferable about this." "About the hearing?" "About everything," Caleb said. "The hearing, the proposal. He's going to say he told me so. In detail, probably more than once." Clara smiled, a full one, unhurried, the kind she'd been allowing more often in the past weeks. "He did tell you so, from what I understand." "He tells me things constantly," Caleb said. "Most of them are unsolicited. Most of them were right, though." He glanced at her. "Most of them," he allowed. She laughed. It was quiet and genuine, and it moved through the cold air between them and settled somewhere in Caleb's chest with the easy permanence of something that belonged there. He kept his eyes on the road, and he did not try to examine or manage or contain what he was feeling. He simply let it be what it was, which was warmth, which was certainty, which was the particular, steady happiness of a man who has stopped running from the life that was right in front of him and started driving toward it instead. Behind them, Cheyenne receded. Ahead, Red Hollow waited. And somewhere between the two, Caleb Morgan understood fully, without reservation, without the armor of practicality, or the weight of grief, or the management of careful distance, that the lonely cowboy who had stood at the edge of a crowd with his hat pulled low and said those words that a whole town had. Hurd was not the same man holding these reins now. And the difference had a name. He was going to marry her in that church, with Thomas standing beside him being insufferable about having been right, and Eliza crying the way Eliza cried at everything joyful, and Deke in his best hat looking deeply uncomfortable and deeply glad. And Bo, who could now read the feed chart and 3 chapters of the Bible, and was working his way through a history book. Clara had sent for from back east, sitting in the front row with the expression of someone who understood, even at 17, that he was watching something worth watching. He could see all of it. He could see it clearly. And for the first time in 4 years, the future didn't feel like something to endure. It felt like something to ride toward. They came home to Red Hollow on a Thursday afternoon, and the town knew before the wagon reached the main street. That was the thing about small places, they had their own nervous system, some collective awareness that moved faster than any rider. By the time Caleb pulled the wagon up to the general store, Frank Henley was already standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and an expression that was trying hard to be neutral and failing completely. 3 other men from the street had stopped walking. Mrs. Patterson was visible in the window of her shop, not even pretending to be doing something else. Caleb climbed down. He extended his hand to Clara. She took it and stepped down beside him. And she was still holding it when he turned to face the street. He hadn't planned what he was going to say. He'd thought about it on the ride back and decided that planning it was the wrong instinct, that what this moment required was not a speech, but simply the truth, stated without management or softening. The way Clara had taught him by example to state things. He looked at Henley first. Caldwell's complaint was dismissed, he said. It carried in the cold air. The water rights are confirmed. Arthur Peel has the documentation on record with the Territorial Land Office, and the Commissioner has opened an independent review of Caldwell's easement arrangements across the valley. He paused. Anyone who had dealings with Caldwell on those arrangements should talk to a lawyer. Henley uncrossed his arms slowly. All of it? The whole complaint? Every part of it, Caleb said. The street was quiet for a moment. Then Henley looked at Clara. The records, he said. Word is you're the one who found them. The records were there, Clara said. Someone just needed to look in the right place. Henley studied her. Then he nodded, once the same decisive nod he'd given her in the general store, the morning they'd come to town together and faced the gossip down. It meant the same thing it had meant then. It meant, I've decided. Come get your supply order when you're ready, he said. I put aside the flour and the dried goods you listed. Figured you'd be back. Clara looked at him. Thank you, Mr. Henley. Frank, he said. He went back inside. Caleb looked at the street. Looked at Mrs. Patterson's window. She had the grace, when his eyes met hers, to step back from the glass. He looked at the other men. They had the sense to be busy with something else. He looked at Clara beside him, and she was looking at him with that expression. She had the quiet, contained, almost imperceptible warmth that he had learned, over the past weeks, was the loudest thing about her. First vote, she said quietly. Henley was already decided, Caleb said. The rest of them weren't, she said. They are now. She was right. He knew she was right. And he knew something else, that walking back into Red Hollow beside her, holding her hand in front of whoever wanted to look, had been its own kind of statement. The kind that didn't need words, because the fact of it was the statement. They drove home. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon light, and Clara's posture changed beside him. Something opening, something settling. He saw it and recognized it because he felt it himself. That particular physical relief of her arriving somewhere that belongs to you. Deke was in the yard. He saw the wagon coming and waited. When Caleb pulled up, and Deke saw their faces, both of them, together, without the weight they'd carried, out his jaw relaxed in the way it did when he was satisfied about something, but wasn't going to make a production of it. Well, Deke said. It's done, Caleb said. Deke looked at Clara. The records. Found them on the 3rd day, she said. Deke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the tone of a man making a substantial admission, I've worked ranches my whole life. Worked for 4 different men. Never once saw a woman who understood land the way you understand land." He paused. "Just wanted to say that." Clara looked at him. "I learned it from watching people who worked hard for things worth keeping," she said. "People like you." Deke looked away. He found something on the horizon that needed examination. After a moment he said gruffly, "Martinez got the north fence rebuilt. Solid this time. Ran a double-wire line." He picked up his hat from the fence post. "Welcome home," he said, and he walked away before anything else could be said. Caleb looked at Clara. "That is Deke Harmon saying he's glad you're here." "I know," she said. "I've learned his language." Bo appeared from the barn at a near run, skidded to a stop, and presented Clara with a folded piece of paper that he had clearly been keeping ready for her return. She took it and opened it and read it, and her face did something it rarely did in public. It moved completely, openly, the composure entirely set aside. She looked up at Bo. "You wrote this?" she said. "Copied it first," Bo said. "From the history book, then wrote it myself. The spelling's not all right yet." "The spelling is fine," she said. Her voice had something in it that she was working to manage. "The handwriting is excellent." Bo straightened, with the particular dignity of a 17-year-old who has been told something that matters. "Figured you'd want to see." "I'd been practicing," he said, and then walked back to the barn with carefully performed casualness. Caleb leaned slightly and read the paper over her shoulder. It was a paragraph from the history book she'd sent for something about the settlement of the Western Territories, copied in Bo's careful, developing hand. At the bottom, in his own words, the boy had written, "Thank you for showing me the words. They were always there, I just couldn't see them." Caleb straightened. He said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. Clara folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, and pressed her hand flat against it, for a moment, and then she turned toward the house and said, "I'll start supper," in a voice that was entirely ordinary, which was exactly how she handled the things that got deepest inside her. Thomas arrived an hour later, as Caleb had predicted he would, with Eliza and a barely suppressed energy that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment since the rider had brought the letter from Cheyenne. He lasted approximately 4 minutes before he said it. "I told you," he said. "Thomas," Eliza said. "I told you from the beginning," Thomas said, addressing Caleb with the gleeful precision of a man whose patience had been rewarded. "I said, you need someone. I said, write the letter. I said, don't be an idiot about whoever comes." He gestured at Clara, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, listening to all of this with an expression of contained amusement. "And you spent 6 weeks being careful and restrained, and managing everything at arm's length when anyone with eyes could see." "Thomas," Caleb said. "Yes? We're getting married," Caleb said. Thomas stopped. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Clara. He looked back at Caleb. Then he turned to Eliza and said, "With complete conviction, I told you." Eliza made a sound that was equal parts laughter and exasperation, and crossed the room and took Clara's hands and looked at her with the warm directness that was entirely Eliza's own. "Are you happy?" she said, quietly, just to Clara. Clara looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said. Simply and completely. "Good," Eliza said, and pulled her into an embrace that Clara accepted with the slight stiffness of someone who wasn't accustomed to being embraced. And then, after a moment, returned properly. They had dinner together, and it was loud and warm. And Thomas told a story about the first time he'd seen Caleb try to talk to a woman at a dance 30 years ago, that Caleb denied entirely, and that Clara found funnier than she was trying to let show. And afterward, Eliza and Thomas drove home, and the ranch settled into its evening sounds, and Caleb and Clara sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. "Reverend Hayes," Clara said. "I'll speak to him this week," Caleb said. "Soon," she said. "I don't want to wait for things I'm certain about." He looked at her. "How 3 weeks?" she said. "4 at most, long enough for it to be done properly. Short enough that it isn't a performance." He nodded. 3 weeks. She looked at the lamp for a moment. "My father would have liked you," she said. He was quiet. He liked people who worked for things, she said, who didn't expect the world to come to them, who understood that whatever you were given meant nothing compared to what you built. She paused. He would have liked this ranch. He would have liked watching you manage it. She met his eyes. And he would have had a great deal to say to you. About irrigation channels. Caleb smiled, a real one, unhurried. I'd have listened, he said. He would have talked for hours, she said. You've been warned. The weeks that followed had a different quality to them. Not the tension of the earlier weeks, not the constant alert management of threat and response, but something fuller and slower and more permanent. The ranch ran the way it was supposed to run. The water rights were secure. Arthur sent word that the Territorial Land Office review had already turned up 2 other property arrangements of Caldwell's that were under scrutiny, and that 2 of the neighboring ranchers who had been living under Caldwell's easement agreements were quietly exploring their options. Caldwell himself had gone very quiet. His silence was, in its way, the loudest statement he could make. But what Caleb noticed most was what happened inside the daily life of the ranch. Clara had become, without announcement or ceremony, the person everyone came to. Not instead of Caleb, that was important, that was something she was careful about, never positioning herself between him and his men or his decisions. But alongside him, parallel to him. Deke brought her the supply questions because she'd proven she could negotiate a better price than anyone else without it becoming adversarial. Martinez consulted her about the irrigation channel on the east side, the one she'd suggested in her first week, which was now 3/4 dug and would, by spring, solve the water access problem on the northern pasture that Caleb had been working around for years. Bo had expanded from the history book to a second book Clara had ordered, and was now reading aloud to 2 of the younger hands, in the evenings, which nobody had suggested and nobody had organized it. It had simply happened. The way things tend to happen, when the conditions for them are right. On the evening before the wedding, Thomas came and found Caleb alone in the barn. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood beside Caleb and looked at the horses. You know what I've been thinking about, Thomas said. Whatever it is, you're going to tell me. That night 4 years ago, Thomas said. November, after Margaret, he paused. You sat in that house for 3 days and didn't come out. I rode over every day, left food on the porch. On the 3rd day you came out, and you looked at me, and you said I don't remember how to want anything. And I didn't know what to say to that, I just didn't know. Caleb was quiet. I know now, Thomas said. The answer is you wait until something comes along that's real enough to remind you. He looked at Caleb. She's real enough. Caleb looked at his oldest friend. Yes, he said, she is. Thomas nodded. He picked up his hat. Get some sleep. You look terrible. He walked out, and the barn was quiet again, and Caleb stood there in the good silence of a man who has found his way back from a place he thought he'd never leave. The wedding happened on a Saturday morning in the church, Reverend Hayes had offered, with the particular cold clarity of a Wyoming December. That made everything look sharpened and present. The town came, not all of it, but most of it, and the ones who came were the ones who mattered. Henley and his wife, Martha, who rarely attended social occasions, but had made an exception here, sitting with the solidly reasonable expression of people who had made a correct judgment. Deke in his best hat, exactly as Caleb had imagined, with the expression of a man who was glad about something, and dealing with that gladness by being extremely still. Martinez and his wife and their 3 children, the youngest of whom had fallen asleep against Martinez's shoulder before the ceremony began. Bo in the front row, with his back straight and his hands on his knees and the absolute serious attention of someone who understood he was watching something worth remembering. Eliza cried before it started, which was entirely on schedule. Thomas stood beside Caleb and said, under his breath, with 30 years of friendship loaded into 4 words, "You did it right." Caleb said nothing back. He didn't need to. Clara came down the aisle without ceremony, without a procession, without performance. She walked the way she did everything, directly, with intention, without looking to either side to assess the room. She looked at Caleb, only at Caleb, and the expression on her face was not the composed, managed, carefully held expression he'd first seen on the stagecoach platform. It was open, fully, entirely open. The composure was there, it would always be there. It was part of who she was, but it was not armor now. It was just her face, looking at him, with nothing hidden and nothing held back. He thought about the moment she had stepped off that stagecoach. About the words he'd said, without meaning to say them, that can't be my bride, and the quiet, devastating accuracy of that sentence. Because she wasn't. She wasn't the bride he'd constructed in his head, from a letter and an expectation, and a set of careful, practical requirements. She was something the letter couldn't have predicted, and the expectation couldn't have contained. And he had been right. That first moment. She wasn't the bride he'd been expecting. She was incomparably more. Reverend Hayes spoke. The words were the words that had been said in churches since, before either of them was born, worn smooth by 1,000 repetitions, and they were perfect for being so, because this was not a moment that needed novelty. This was a moment that needed weight, and the old words had weight. When it came to his vows, Caleb had decided to say exactly what was true. I am not an easy man, he said, and heard Thomas almost law and control it. I know that. You know that better than anyone, probably. I work too much, and I don't say things until they're overdue, and I spent 4 years forgetting how to be present with another person. He held Clara's hands. He looked at her. You reminded me. Not by asking me to be different than I am, but by standing beside what I am and deciding it was worth staying for. I will spend whatever time I have left being worthy of that decision. I promise you that. Clara looked at him with clear, steady eyes. When she spoke, her voice was even, but it had something in it that only he was close enough to hear, the particular quality of someone saying a true thing in full, without anything held in reserve. I came west not looking for rescue, she said. I told you that. I was looking for ground worth standing on. She paused. I found that. I found this ranch and these people and this work. But I found something I didn't know to look for. Someone who trusts my judgment and tells me the truth and holds my hand in the dark without making a performance of it. Her hands tightened on his. You are the reason I know the difference between building a life and living one. I promise to stand beside you for every year of it. The church was entirely silent. Reverend Hayes finished what needed to be finished. Caleb kissed his wife. Eliza made a sound that she would later describe as restrained. Thomas said quietly, to the general vicinity, I told him to write that letter. What followed was not a dramatic transformation. That was the thing that people in Red Hollow would talk about later. When they told this story to their children, and eventually to their grandchildren, they would say that what was remarkable about Caleb and Clara Morgan was not the drama of how they came together, though the Caldwell business gave that plenty of material. What was remarkable was the ordinary, extraordinary quality of what they built after. Clara paid the $42 to the pharmacy in Hartley. She paid it herself, from her own savings, which she had rebuilt over the months at the ranch, and she sent the payment with a letter explaining who she was and thanking them for their patience. She received a reply 3 weeks later from the pharmacist's son, who now ran the shop, saying that he remembered Dr. Whitmore and that the debt had already been forgiven long ago, and she needn't have sent anything, but that the letter meant a great deal, and he wished her well. She framed the reply and put it in the office beside her father's filing receipt. The irrigation channel on the east side was completed in February, 2 months ahead of the spring dry season, and the northern pasture, that had been a constant management problem for 3 years, became the most productive section of the ranch by the following summer. Martinez took quiet personal pride in this, expressed itself as a total refusal to take any credit whenever it came up. Bo turned 18 in March. Clara organized a birthday dinner for him at the ranch with the other hands, and the boy sat at the head of the table, looking simultaneously overwhelmed and determined to appear unbothered, and afterward he found Clara and thanked her, in the careful, complete sentences of someone who had worked hard to command language and was using that command deliberately. She told him he was going to be capable of anything he decided to be capable of. He believed her because she was Clara Morgan, and she did not say things she didn't mean. He started saving money the following month with a destination in mind that he hadn't told anyone about yet, but that had something to do with a law school advertisement Clara had cut from a newspaper and left on the bunkhouse table without comment. Deke Harmon worked the Morgan Ranch for 11 more years, long past the age when most men retired from the work. When people asked him why he didn't rest, he said, "Good work is worth doing right, and that's not a thing you stop doing just because your knees hurt." He never used Clara's name in his explanations of things, but the people who knew him well enough understood that what he meant by good work being worth doing right was the particular standard she had applied to everything she touched, which had become, without announcement, the standard the entire Morgan Ranch operated by. Eliza Reed became Clara's closest friend in the complete and lasting way that had always been obvious to everyone, except Clara, who was not a person who assumed permanence in relationships until permanence had been earned. It was earned over dinners and difficult conversations, and one particular February blizzard that left Eliza snowed in at the Morgan Ranch for 3 days, at the end of which she and Clara had talked through more real things than most people manage in years. Thomas declared this the best outcome of the worst storm in a decade, which earned him a look from Eliza that he wisely did not further analyze. In the spring after the wedding, Caleb found Clara in the office late one evening with papers spread across the desk, but not the ranch papers, not the accounts or the supply orders. She was writing a letter. He looked at it without meaning to read it, but he caught enough to understand. She was writing to the marriage agency. Not for herself. She was writing to recommend the agency to a woman she'd heard about through Eliza, a widow in Casper, with 2 children and no prospects, who was afraid of exactly the same thing Clara had been afraid of, before 2 sentences changed the direction of her life. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. "She's capable," Clara said. "She just needs someone who isn't looking for perfect. Someone who's looking for real." Caleb looked at his wife. He thought about a cold Wyoming morning and a stagecoach and 4 words he'd said without meaning to. He thought about ground worth standing on. He thought about all the things he would have missed, all the specific and irreplaceable things, if he had been the man he was trying to be instead of the man he actually was. In the moment she stepped off that coach. "Tell her to say what's true," he said, in her own words. "Not what she thinks they want to hear." Clara looked at him. "I already wrote that part," she said. He smiled. She turned back to her letter. He went to pour himself coffee and came back with a second cup for her, and she took it without looking up, and he sat in the other chair, with the evening sounds of the ranch outside, and the lamp between them and the particular settled warmth of a house that had become exactly what it was supposed to be. Years later, when people asked Caleb Morgan what he had learned from the Caldwell business, from the legal fight, from everything that had happened in those first months, he gave an answer that surprised most of them, because they expected something about land or water rights, or the importance of keeping your property. Instead, he said, "The most dangerous thing a man can do is decide in advance what he needs. Because if you've already decided, you'll miss what's actually in front of you. You'll stand at the edge of a crowd with your hat pulled low, and your mind already made up. And something extraordinary will walk toward you, and you'll almost lose it before you have the sense to understand what it is." He said it once to Thomas, on a summer evening, sitting on the porch of the Morgan Ranch, with 2 cups of coffee and the sound of Clara's voice somewhere inside the house, talking to Eliza, the particular warm cadence of 2 women who had decided to know each other completely. Thomas listened. He nodded slowly. He sipped his coffee. Then he said, "I told you to write the letter." Caleb looked at him. "You did. I said you needed someone real. I said stop being a ghost." "You did, and you spent 2 months arguing with me about it." "I did." Thomas looked at him, and Caleb listened to Clara's inside steady and clear and entirely hers, the voice of a woman who said true things and meant them, who had found her ground and stood on it and built something worth keeping. And Caleb said, "You were right, that was the whole story." And it was enough, and it was everything. A lonely man had stood at the edge of a crowd and said, "That can't be my bride." And he had been absolutely correct, because the woman walking toward him was not a bride. She was the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. She was the ground he hadn't known he was looking for. She was Clara Morgan. She had always been exactly who she was. And that precisely and completely, that had been enough to bring a man back to life.